Sometimes I received questions like, can we have several activation metrics, or can we have different activation metrics for different use cases, which makes sense. However, I would say my recommendation would be to start in a very simple way, uncovering that one core action that should be the same across all of your use cases. So for even horizontal products like Canva, it's probably connected to a file creation. File is a file, and it can be a presentation, it can be a document, it can be anything. And later on, you can niche it towards specific use cases. And it will inevitably become more complex as your product becomes more complex. So I wouldn't recommend, if you're just starting this adventure, creating 5 activation metrics for different personas, for different use cases. Create one, and then later on, you will define different sub-versions of this activation metric if you need.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good learning there. Thrivers all around the world, welcome back to Thrivecast. I'm your host, Guru Raj. And today we have an incredible guest to our podcast studio. It's an online studio, of course. We'll be doing some screen sharing if you could use YouTube or Spotify to watch the video upload as well. Just to quickly introduce Kate, she is a growth advisor. I recently found her almost about 7 to 8 months back on Kyle Poyer's blog. It's called The Evolution of Miro's User Onboarding. You'll have the link in the show notes as well. And since then, I've been keeping tabs on her newsletter. And one after the other, I'm seeing really beautifully explained concept, which is where I fell in love with. She is a growth advisor. She has worked at Miro recently. I think she's completed about 1 year in the Growth Mate podcast. Some of you who have subscribed to her newsletter, you might have guessed it right. She is Kate Syuma. Kate, you are a solopreneur now. I hear that you are a founder of Great Mates, and since 1.5 years or so, you've been working with dozens of leaders across the board. You've been advising to various startups. You live in beautiful Amsterdam, Netherlands. And by the way, this is a beautiful time to visit or be there in Amsterdam at this moment. Kate, you have worked with many leaders across Dropbox, Amplitude, Canva, Atlassian, Code, and many, many guests on your podcast as well. What I've found interesting in Kate and her newsletter is that she's brilliantly mixing 3 concepts together, which I struggle to mix it in my head, but she does it really well. A PLG, user experience, and leadership, all 3 together. By the way, I asked ChatGPT to introduce Kate, and this is what it said. And I quote, it says, Kate is the aha moment girl. She's always beaming with a great UX smile. She talks leadership, and she acts like a leader. Welcome, Kate. How are you?
Wow, Guru, for such a warm introduction, and thanks ChatGPT for so many kind words. Didn't expect that. I'm so happy to be on your show and flattered for everything you've mentioned, and it's my pleasure to continue delivering this content to the community. Excited about this conversation as well.
ChatGPT also sent me along. By the way, I'm using the Microsoft Copilot and ChatGPT side by side. I'm trying out things. In Copilot, it was able to recognize your LinkedIn profile. It went through a couple of your posts and it was able to summarize. But in ChatGPT, I could not get the same. I'm not sure what's happening there. It's very likely I might have to upgrade my prompts better. But Kate, for the users who don't know you much, could you explain a little bit of what you do, what is Growth Mates, and how did you get into the world of, I think some people refer to it as the design for growth. So could you maybe introduce the audience on a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. My pleasure. I think you've covered several things that I'm focused on right now. But before that, I spent over 6 years at Mira, where I started as a product designer when the company was at seed round, I think, just about 50 people. I was the employee number 63rd. And since that time, I grew with the company and passed several growth chapters through the hypergrowth, through Series A, B, and ended up at Series C, a unicorn, as a head of growth product design, and built the team of product, content designers, and also contributed to scaling the growth function, where I've been one of the first founding members, from one cross-functional team to the stream of 5 sub-streams, over 100 people over these 6 years. And during my whole career, I've been passionate about 2 things, actually. My education is in business and IT. However, my passion is in creating things, as you've seen probably. And I've been a product designer. I deeply cared about user experience. Then I started transition to the leadership role. I started diving deeper into psychology. And I started thinking, what is the combination of these things like user experience, psychology, and leadership? And I just found this product-led growth space a great combination. Also, like connected me to this business acumen, and this is where I spent my entire career, I think. And now I'm trying to help companies across the world to create both like amazing high quality user experience, but with product-led growth strategies in place. So primarily right now, as I'm not hands-on anymore, I'm not a hands-on designer, I'm positioning myself as a growth advisor. However, I'm trying to leverage my experience in both product-led growth and user experience angle. And how I love explaining people that product-led growth is all about self-serve user experience. But if your product is not self-servable, there is no such a thing as a product-led growth. You cannot introduce that, you cannot leverage that pretty well. This is why, in order to create this self-servable user experience, you really need to care of the quality of intuitiveness of that experience. And this is what I'm trying to do. And GrowthMates is like a side project, actually, that I started also in my time at Mira. It was first sort of a ritual, internal ritual, when we invited some well-known guests, well-known leaders from other companies just to talk to us internally. At some point, we turned it into the podcast, but then I started like working on that a bit more and took it with me when I left Mira after 6 years. And now I'm working on that, inviting amazing guests from all various companies like Amplitude, Adobe, Atlassian, Intercom, Coda, Canva, you name them, to talk about their approach to building growth teams, building high quality products, also building their careers in growth. And this is called GrowthMates, and we are approaching our first GrowthMates anniversary.
Super. I think Kate going to go continue and learn from many of the experiences that you have from your Substack. So I've picked up a couple of screenshots on onboarding experiences, activation. So before we get started, could you maybe introduce a tad bit about what is activation and why is it important for SaaS companies? And maybe we'll start off with that, and then we'll go to specific cases around what is good activation, what's bad activation, what's any mistakes around it, and so on and so forth. So maybe let's start off with what is activation.
Absolutely. So I would be like super short, and I think a lot of people probably are already familiar with this Reforge framework that explains activation. And basically, in my opinion, it's like you need to deliver the core value of your product, and your user has to experience the core value of the product and create a habit around using this core value of the product. So the activation framework shows exactly this path. So first, there is a setup moment. It's the moment when users got ready to experience the value of the product. The second phase is aha moment. It's the first moment when they experience the core value of the product for the first time. Let's say if we are talking about some product like Notion, probably like creating a document and sharing it with someone because it's a collaborative tool for documentation, let's say, and note-taking. And the third phase is habit moment. It's when the user is experiencing this core value repeatedly and like several times and creates a habit around using the product. So the whole thing is activation, and we have these three core phases of that. And why it's important, I think the actual definition speaks for itself. We are creating the products to deliver some value, so we need to make sure that users uncovered that value and adopted that value and created a repeating habitual use of the product. If we are not doing that, it's kind of questionable why we are actually building the product, why we are trying to leverage some goals like monetization, because if we don't have these covered yet, we cannot actually drive the monetization if users haven't even experienced the basic core value for the first time.
So I think what you're saying is let the users experience the core value by themselves, mostly on a self-serve basis. And if they like the product, they're going to go use it more. Getting to like the product is essentially what you're saying is do that setup, try it out, and showcase the value of the product so that they can engage and you can then monetize better. Is that how we can quickly understand it?
Yeah, we can understand it like that. And we also have data in the industry and benchmarks that show us that activation has like very deep connection with retention rates and even monetization. So for example, in general, like if we take B2B, for example, activated users have 4 to 5 times bigger conversion rate to paid. And this is quite logical, right? So if they experience the value, they uncover the benefits of the product, maybe they impact several use cases and they are more likely to convert. So definitely there is a connection here. And what I also like to share as an example, I think a lot of times people uncover a lot of problems in monetization and they want to drive the revenue in a very direct way. Like, let's change the pricing, let's change our pricing page or like our upgrade flows. But the root cause of these problems are quite often can be found in onboarding experience. So we don't have the problem with pricing or like people don't understand different plans. Of course, there are always some optimizations there, but the deepest cause of these issues is like happening way earlier in the journey. And I love bringing that as an example of importance, why we need to focus on user onboarding, because everybody wants to drive ARR and profitability, and revenue is like a big thing these days. But for some reasons, people are trying to solve this problem like in a very direct way. Let's just do something that immediately and not thinking about user onboarding as an essential phase of that.
Yeah, I think you put it well. I think if you want retention or engagement to be better, fix your activation. And activation is, you use the word root. It's the root of your retention. It's the root of your monetization. Super. With that, maybe with that as the basis, why don't we go to a screen sharing and then we will check on and learn from some of the blog posts that you have posted around various use cases on how other companies do activation. So let's do that. So let me share my screen. Okay. Hopefully you're able to see my screen there. Super. I think maybe while we jump into it, and by the way, we will have your industry report as part of the show notes as well. The first thing that you mentioned, which caught my attention from your industry report, is that most users drop off during activation. Typically, they drop off soon after the sign up. Could you tell a little bit about this?
Absolutely. So I think first we can just like imagine a typical example of path to activation, or like the whole path that I just explained, like setup moment, aha moment, and habit moment. And if we take that path and if we imagine how many steps there can be in that path, it's quite a long journey. It's quite a challenging journey, especially if we take complex B2B platforms and products like, for example, Amplitude, that requires a manual setup and things like that. And of course, to get there, to get to this habitual use of the product, to experience the activation, it takes a lot of steps, a lot of time, a lot of effort. And users sometimes are like, they are low tech savvy. They are not familiar with platforms like of that complexity, and they just drop. So this is what we have here. Like the whole path to activation has many, many drops, but also in the sign up process, there are a lot of drops. And there are multiple reasons for that. Overall, like it depends on the complexity of that setup and sign up flow. Sometimes there are just too many steps. Sometimes we are asking for too much information, and we can ask for less information, but for more relevant information that we can leverage for personalization. Sometimes we are landing users to the first homepage of the product after this registration flow, and they are completely overwhelmed just because we've shown them all the possibilities of the product, the complex dashboard. We didn't give them any examples, any templates, any personalization, and they just leave. The third situation is, for example, when we don't have any lifecycle communication outside the product. So users are like probably signed up and they left and they forgot about the product, and we never reminded them with the emails and lifecycle communication. So this is where the first session drop is happening. Like they just tried the product, they left, and we never came back to them with some more interesting and engaging communication that could inspire them to come back and check some templates, for example. So you see that there are multiple reasons for that.
Yeah, this is interesting. I'll tell you what catches my attention, and especially for B2B SaaS builders who's listening and watching us, sign up. I was actually very surprised to see that there are drop-offs even during the sign-up stages. Almost about 10% of the drop-offs are happening at these sign-up stages. So this is very interesting. Let me get to the next one. And you had the insight here. And I think for most times, people think that onboarding should be as frictionless as possible. But this was a very interesting insight. You mentioned that if we add some human touch, you have a better success for onboarding. Could you maybe touch a little bit about this? And you have an example of MailChimp here. Maybe could you elaborate that to our audience?
Absolutely. I think this insight is very connected to the nature of complex B2B products. I cannot imagine something like that at the scale of typical B2C platforms. However, for complex B2B products oriented towards teams, for example, it can be quite handy. And I have one example of more B2C related product. It's Superhuman, who is leveraging this method as well. So overall, the complexity of B2B platforms sometimes is too high and people cannot self-serve themselves, let's say. So they just cannot uncover all the possibilities of the product, set it up for themselves. This is why this combination of some manual setup and like onboarding specialists together with this self-service onboarding can be quite interesting here. So we have an example of MailChimp, and even at their scale, they are leveraging this practice. So after the initial registration, you have your self-serve onboarding. Here, of course, you can do everything by yourself. But if you need some help, you can schedule this product tour and demo call with a specialist. I don't know what is their criteria of targeting because I was registering without a corporate email and I still found this banner. I would suggest maybe to be more conscious here and show this only to like PQAs, very relevant accounts and leads, not to waste your resources, and test how it works. Because if it really works well, it seems like it's a combination of these sales strategies when you have your specialist who is like introducing everything in person, and the self-service strategy when you can do it like by yourself. So just in a nutshell, I would recommend to try it out if your product is very complex. If you tried everything on self-serve side and you don't see that the needle is moving, if you see that on user research and user testing, like your people are really struggling, or if you have a very, very long path to a aha moment, let's say 30 days, like really users have to use the product for a very long time and do so many things to get to the final state of activation. So then maybe a combination of these factors can be a reason to introduce something like that. And again, test that. And as I mentioned before, I shared this B2B example. There is Superhuman who is doing exactly that, but also in combination with self-serve onboarding. By the way, we will have a session with Gaurav, with their head of growth, about these strategies. And I think in the beginning of the product, it's very useful to have these demo sessions or onboarding specialists, because on these sessions, you can learn so much about your users. You can see why they are struggling. And if you can dedicate at least one person in your team who can do that, who can spend time on that, it can be an ongoing user research tool for your team, not just for the users, but also for you and for your team.
Yeah. So I think, some great insights there. So if you have a complex B2B product, some human touch might help. By the way, we have finished a podcast recording with Garo from Superhuman. So we've learned quite a bit from that as well. And I think you mentioned about B2C companies not using the human touch as much. I'm seeing that especially in the fintech space, where there's a hesitation for the users. Most of the B2C platforms who are in fintech or banking, they have some human touch as well. So there's some great learnings there. And by the way, I did exactly what you did as well. I also logged into MailChimp using my Gmail as well as my work account. In both the cases, I found the human touch. So they're not essentially doing this separation between work versus personal, but I found that particular insight interesting. Let me quickly
jump in. Interesting.
Let me jump to the next one. You also mentioned that, and this is very interesting, if we have a human touch, you mentioned that the onboarding success rate is now much higher. Could you maybe explain that a little bit about why this might be the case, and is the other way around true as well? Meaning, if you don't have a complex product and you have a frictionless onboarding, what might be the success rate if you compare that to an increased success rate of 80%?
Absolutely. So I think this example is connected to the insight we just discussed. So overall, we conducted the user research and we asked people what was one of the most successful experiments that they ran with the user onboarding. And in the segment of like complex B2B products, we uncovered that particular data or insight, summarized data. Overall, I would say it's hard to compare like side by side these conversion rates. However, you can do so many things without the dedicated onboarding specialist, especially if the product is not extremely complex. On the self-service side, there are so many things you can try out to drive the needle, like starting from AI even these days, right? So we can maybe explore if AI can replace this potential onboarding specialist, right? So if they have some almost a human assistant that like who just do some tasks or automate some complex flows, and then we can speed up the path to aha. So I've heard that there are some nice products who are doing that, and I'm going to record the episode exactly about this impact of AI on aha and activation. So I think we can be very playful now, and I would be maybe very curious to see what will be the impact of AI on the speed to aha in the future, and if we will have some data there.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. By the way, we recorded another session with Zora. That episode's going to go live very soon as well. And they experimented with not so much as dedicated onboarding, because most of the trials were sales-led or essentially the Tiger team led. So there was always a dedicated person for that. What they experimented with is some videos, how to guide on specific use cases. And they found it that click-through rates on that is higher. And if we don't have that, the success rate dips. But if we have that, the success rate increases.
Wow, this is very interesting. I don't know when this episode will be published, but there will be recordings anyways. Together with Amplitude, we are going free sessions with leaders from teams like Gaurav, with Jenny from Loom, and with Reforge. And we will unpack their real examples and real working strategies, and also showcase different visual examples. So for your listeners, maybe as a follow-up, it can be interesting to dive in. And if it will be published, I will share the links as well.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thank you so much. Let me quickly jump to a few more examples. I know you mentioned about MailChimp, so we just covered that. Could you tell a little bit about Miro? I know this is one of the biggest areas that you worked very early on in your career as well, I think a couple of years back. And I read Kyle Poe's article and the way that you guys experimented at Miro. So could you tell a little bit about this particular screenshot that you had, wherein you had just over the mouse cursor, you were able to bring together the right-hand side board. And how did you get to this particular thing? And then what was the experience around it?
Yeah, I think this example is a nice illustration of one of my earliest mistakes on user onboarding. So in this article, I have 3 chapters. The first chapter is about like experimenting on user onboarding in a startup environment. The second chapter is about hypergrowth and the effect of big bets that sometimes they don't pay off. And the third part is about the power of quick wins on a scale-up phase. I think 3 parts are very relevant, and I would recommend just to read through them. This example is from the first part. It was like one of the first experiments on user onboarding that we had that time. We didn't have a lot of best practices in the self-serve environment. It was almost 7 years ago or 6 years when it was shipped. And I was a product designer that time. And I had a lot of user experience focused ideas when I was thinking about the execution of some hypotheses. And it was sometimes hard to match them with the business goals or the risks for the business. So this was exactly this experiment. Basically, what we did that time, we designed like a very nice onboarding flow, like sign-up flow, where alongside the questions, we shown these visual examples of the product itself, which sounds logical. You need to show value to your users to drive the conversion on each step. However, the interactions on that side were quite distracting. So when users were trying to, let's say, walk along the flow, we've seen that they were interacting with the sticky notes and got distracted. And because of that, we had a drop on each single step of the sign-up flow. And the cumulative effect of that experiment was negative, because if you have a drop let's say on the invitation page, on the template selection page, on the setup page, it's like overall a huge drop happened in comparison with the original solution. So unfortunately, we had to redesign that and remove these nice visuals and interactive motion experience. However, later on, the team also introduced it back in a different manner when it was less interactive and less distraction happened here, but still showing the value in some format. And another probably UX or behavioral principle to put here is the interaction cost. We need to reduce the interaction cost on each single step of the flow to make sure that users get to the actual end result and the goal. And here there was unnecessary interaction. So this interaction with the sticky notes wasn't necessary here. We can bring it a bit later. When users signed up successfully, we can show how to learn and play in a way with the sticky notes. But here it was unnecessary. And this is why I think it was a wise decision that time to just remove all of that, make the flow very clean, focused on actual questions, and just put everything in the center of the screen, white background, progressive disclosure of these questions one by one, and make it focused on these actual questions, removing all distractions, and then you will see the increase on your sign-up flows conversion rate.
Yeah, that's a great insight. So looks like too much of a beautiful UX can be distracting, and they might probably focus on the right side of the visual distraction rather than getting the activation. That's a great insight. So let's quickly jump to Canva. And I think you mentioned quite a bit about Canva, on how Canva built the interaction screen. They had a lot of visuals in this. Do you want to touch a little bit about how the experience was with Canva and how they have progressed it now?
Sure. I think when I mentioned this example and what I mentioned before, it's like learn by doing or learn by playing method. So Canva is a horizontal product. They have a lot of use cases. They are targeting a lot of different personas. And they also need to uncover some sort of scalable way to onboard their users and make it personal and introduce some personalization. And what I liked when I tried out their recent flow is this selection of different demo presentations that walk you through different use cases and core features in the product. And they have different slides. And overall, the whole presentation is called Your First Week in Canva, where they explain you some features and then they give you some area to play with them in a safe environment. So you will not break anything here. They are not asking you to create the actual presentation with that file. It's just for you to understand all the capabilities in a playful manner and learn and play right here. And what is interesting that on the last slide, they also introduce some sort of investment loops or growth loops. So after you finish the first presentation, they show you that there is a gallery of all learn and play templates where you can go and uncover new use cases. So they are thinking about the activation to other use cases very early on. Sometimes we are waiting while our users will activate in the first use case, and after several months, we can introduce another use case, and they are doing that very early. I think we should do that early because we don't know sometimes users, what they are selecting in the actual sign-up flow is not very reliable information. Sometimes they are in a hurry and they are not thinking what they are clicking. This is why I think it's super helpful to show them the whole gallery of templates, gallery of use cases, show them all the things you have, even on your website, right? So, and then along the way and making it very consistent. So how we name these use cases, how we show these use cases should be consistent from the website to the first session and moving forward. So Canva is a good example of that practice.
Yeah, so I think, there's a market difference between how Miro and Canva took an approach on onboarding. Miro essentially asked one question at a time, had a very focused, hey, this is what you want to do, go try this out. Canva, on the other hand, showed a lot of these templates so you can go try and learn various things. Very interesting. I think even Airtable is doing very similar to Miro. They're asking one question at a time, looking at what the specific intent is and showcasing some of that. So this template approach, I found it very interesting with Canva. So that's why I thought I'd bring this up here. Quickly jumping on to Intercom. So Kate, you mentioned about a checklist or an onboarding hub that Intercom uses. Could you maybe describe a little bit of what is an onboarding hub and why did you like Intercom's approach to the onboarding hub?
Yeah, I think overall Intercom is on their way to building the onboarding hub or something similar to that. but they have different types of onboarding materials. So this is what I really like. It's important when your product has a lot of sub-products or multiple use cases or very complex setup for each of the products. So you cannot just create a simple presentation about that or a simple checklist about all of that. And you need to organize that information in some way. And sometimes like these products, like complex products, they are trying to uncover a simple solution for that, but this simple solution just doesn't exist. So we really need to think of different types of information. Sometimes we need to think of articles, videos, checklists, demo sessions, and combine them in a very easy to navigate environment. And then you have this onboarding hub where users can go later on after the first session, after the third or second session, they can invite their team to that space. They can find some information there. And then they can choose what type of onboarding information is most suitable for them. Do they want to read an article? Do they want to watch a video? You can give them all these options, and they, not all of them, but most important and relevant options. And they can choose because all people have different mental models and different learning styles. And we cannot just hit all of them with one shot and one solution.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned a couple of things there. Maybe just for our listeners, a little bit of that. So if you have multiple use cases like what Intercom has, in fact, Intercom has multiple products. Each product might need to be set up independently. And each, I'm guessing, Kate, what you mentioned by that is each product has its own activation flow. Each use case has its own activation flow. So instead of you asking them, hey, do you want to do set up help desk or do you want to set up AI chatbot? You bring them to an onboarding hub and let the user navigate through that. Is that what you mean by an onboarding hub, wherein after the sign up, you get the user to the hub and let them navigate through that? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, and they can also easily navigate themselves. So if you design this hub well, there is a certain navigation, search, and everything here. They can use it as a tool afterwards because these complex products, they require a lot of actions, a lot of setup, a lot of interaction to adopt these products. This is why I imagine in products like that, the users interact with this onboarding hub for several weeks and maybe even longer, and then they can share it with their teammates and ask them for help with this activating certain use cases. So it's more for products that require continuous onboarding and like very long-term onboarding. I think many products and mostly all of them require continuous onboarding. So it's not the first session. I also share in one of the articles like 6 stages of user onboarding, one of the last ones. And I think we should consider all of them. And onboarding hub is a nice solution where we can collect all of the experiments, all of the resources we already created as a team, not just to remove them, but collect them and organize them in a nice and visual format.
Makes sense. I think I'm seeing this particular kind of an onboarding style or an onboarding hub starting to get used across multiple B2B SaaS products, which have multiple kind of a compound startup. Each of these products, their own startup by itself, right? So they give a space to that, and then the setup of that happens a lot more organically through this onboarding hub. Super. So let's quickly jump into linear. And you mentioned about a couple of things in linear. Could you maybe explain what is linear in this bit, and then why do you like this onboarding?
Sure. So linear is modern Jira, sort of. It's a platform for like all of the task tracking and product development management in one place. And it's quite complex by default. Like it's quite complex system. I like linear for their attention to UX details and the intuitive experience. So instead of building additional tooltips, all of this explanation and hacking the growth loops, they are trying to build a very good product, a very intuitive experience that is a fundamental principle for self-service strategy. And I do believe that we need to think of fundamentals first. And if they are designed very well, we will not need additional tooltips and banners and pop-ups in our product. So here, I don't know, this example is probably not about the onboarding. It's more about interesting limitations in their free plan and how they explain them in a very clear way without extra visuals, animations. Everything is clear here. And if you see these limitations consistently across your workflow in the product several times, you would consider to upgrade at certain moment. And as for onboarding, they are using a very simple checklist format. that is also very intuitive. And the checklist, that every task in their checklist is connected to a real task you would have to do to use this platform. So it's learn by doing in a way that it's not learn and play environment. It's more like just try it out on one of the projects right now.
Yeah.
And they explain contextually how to do every single step. So how to create the first issue, how to organize these issues and things like that in a very intuitive and very organic way. So if we imagine the product without extra pop-ups, third-party onboarding components, just the product itself, they are trying to onboard their users through this organic way, like just use the product. We build all of this clear and intuitive experience for you, so you can just actually start using and you will uncover everything by yourself. And hopefully you will get activated. So I think this is very beautiful.
Yeah, I think well said on that. So I think I've also seen many products where they have this free plan kind of a thing, either on the bottom left or on the top right. But when you click on them, you go directly to various plans. Linear has made it extremely intuitive. And you're absolutely right on showcasing the limits is, especially if you go from free plan to various paid plans, becomes a very important messaging why they should upgrade, essentially the pricing escalator. Super. I think let's quickly jump into a couple of mistakes. And I've taken about maybe 2 or 3 mistakes that you have mentioned on your blog post. The first one I want to touch upon is not really the mistake number 1, but mistake number 2 that you have on your blog post, which is the teams are not understanding the value of the growth teams in general, and activation is not becoming guardrail. So could you tell a little bit about why growth is a complex system and why should this mistake, or how should they avoid this mistake?
Absolutely. So I think like in general, people who are getting familiar with growth, they know that growth consists of different steps of the funnel. And it's not just a system. I think now it's an ecosystem. We have all the steps of the growth funnel, from acquisition, activation, engagement, retention, like that form retention, and then monetization, and then expansion, and growth loops that connect all of them, or growth loops within these steps of the funnel. Then we have a community as a piece of the growth ecosystem. So we have so many things that are interconnected. Mm-hmm. And I think even when we start introducing, let's say, product-led growth as a model, we need to think of that as an ecosystem, not as just one step of that. Let's think of acquisition only. Let's think of activation only. So if we take activation as an example and why it's connected to, let's say, acquisition and monetization. So I already gave an example how it's connected to monetization, and that we have the benchmarks of like higher conversion rate. It's also connected to retention, because if we use personalization as a strategy, it helps us in activation and it helps in the further retention framework as well. Also, I love taking activation as an example in retention when we are thinking about new features, let's say. A lot of teams are still building beautiful features. They are launching these features. However, they are not thinking of activation of these new features. Let's imagine another product just created a new way of introducing something with AI. And they launched that feature, but they haven't activated that feature, meaning that they haven't onboarded their existing users and new users to this new experience. And the same strategies or very similar strategies to user onboarding can be applied for activation of new features. And when we are doing all of that consistent, we are leveraging and increasing the adoption of these features, meaning that we are also increasing the retention or monetization if these features are paid. So it's very connected. And connection of acquisition and activation is happening a bit earlier. And here there is an example that if acquisition and activation teams, let's say, are not aligned on their key result or their goal of who they are actually activating or acquiring, the result can be very disappointing. Because let's say acquisition team is attracting these particular leads or profiles, and they are not relevant to the activation team, or they are not enough relevant for the actual product, meaning that acquisition team is focused on the wrong ICPs or not enough clear. They don't have even enough clear information to target for the right ICPs. This is why activation team need to think about what are the criteria of selection these people, what questions we need to ask them in our sign-up flow. what is their type of business, what is their team size, what is their role, what is the industry, maybe something else. Maybe we need to ask them about their experience with certain tools or methodologies. Are they familiar with development tools or things like that? So then acquisition team can leverage all of that profiling information to attract more relevant ICPs. And usually at scale, it happens if they have a shared key result. So for example, they all are focused on the number of activated corporate customers, let's say. And then the acquisition team is focused on acquiring corporate users, and then activation team is focused on activating the corporate users. But if these corporate users, let's say, doesn't exist as a shared key result in their thinking, then they will be trying to optimize different goals, and activation team will not achieve their goals if they got not enough quality leads. So this is an example.
Even in my own learnings around it, more often than not, feature teams will go build features and throw it out there, and they don't get any usage of that because nobody knows about the existence of those features. And as you rightly said, those features have not been accurately activated. I think in the sales-led world, there would be either a customer success or the salesperson will educate the customer about this particular use case, help them in activation. But in a self-serve world, it's more important to have each features pretty much get activated by its own. Which brings me to an incorrect activation metric. I like the way you said it. It's all connected. The moment you manage your activations well, you'll have monetization and retention well. So could you maybe tell a little bit about why do you think activation metrics are, or many SaaS companies are having an incorrect activation metric? What do you mean by that? And could you give some examples on that? And this could be our last one as part of the mistakes there is.
Sure. I will try to be short because it's probably the question for the entire podcast episode. So first principle is like sometimes people are just not aware how to design the activation metric, and they are trying to just assume what it might be. And this is why it might be not correct when they start doing it properly. So how most of the companies are doing that is like designing it backward from retention, meaning that you first define the habit moment, then you uncover the aha moment that leads to habit, and then you uncover the setup, etc. For that, you need to do a qualitative, and quantitative studies. So like regression analysis and maybe diary studies from the qualitative research side to complement all of these insights. And it's quite heavy. I would say sometimes it requires a full quarter to gather all of this data, understand, but it's worth it because it builds a foundation for your team for the further years. And later on, you will always be able to redesign that metric if you need. I think iteration on that metric, like on a regular basis, also is very good practice, especially if you're just establishing it. And also, I think starting it in a simple way. Sometimes I received questions like, can we have several activation metrics, or can we have different activation metrics for different use cases, which makes sense. However, I would say my recommendation would be to start in a very simple way, uncovering that one core action that should be the same across all of your use cases. So for even horizontal products like Canva, it's probably connected to a file creation. File is a file, and it can be a presentation, it can be a document, it can be anything. And later on, you can niche it towards specific use cases. And it will inevitably become more complex as your product becomes more complex. So I wouldn't recommend, if you're just starting this adventure, creating 5 activation metrics for different personas, for different use cases. Create one, and then later on, you will define different sub-versions of this activation metric if you need.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good learning there. We were having conversations with Amplitude on that, and they figured out that if you have a root activation metric, and if they measure it wrong, it becomes very difficult for them to understand the business. So they went ahead at looking at, did the user actually connect and start sending Amplitude the data? And if the answer to that is no, nothing else matters. Right? So it took them quite a while for them to go experiment.
It's one of the most important metrics to establish. And I've also just concluded the results from one of my recent industry studies about product-led growth and companies who introduced that, and what was the moment when they started introducing that and building the growth team. And I've seen the pattern that when these teams or like existing teams uncovered what is activation and proved that, this was one of the signals to start building a dedicated growth function after that. And when teams connected the correlation and the connection between the activation and the bigger North Star metric for the company, like net revenue retention, then it became a clear signal that, okay, this is a reliable thing. Then we can build on top of that. We can build the whole growth setup on top of that. And just because we are running out of time, and like I want to share as well that these insights will be packaged in a playbook format that I hope will be published when we launch this episode. And everything will be under one umbrella on growthmates.club. It will be the new website for this playbook and different other resources and my advising practice. So growthmates.club, I hope we will publish it by the date of publishing this show.
Yeah. We will add it to the show notes as well. And to the listeners, Kate runs many onboarding courses as well. So we'll have links in the show notes about many of our onboard advisory practices and the courses that she will have. Kate, by the way, I love the session today. I learned quite a bit, and hopefully the listeners learned quite a bit as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Hopefully it will be useful for you and for your audience. And I'm happy to be available for anyone who needs my help. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You take care.